Hello everyone, I'm Chris Norman, the president of the Georgia Association of Land Bank Authorities, Incorporated. I'm here today to give you a land banking one-on-one overview so that you can learn everything there is to understand about land banks from a high level as you anticipate or contemplate using them in your communities. So this is kind of the topics we're going to walk through today. I'm going to do a quick land bank 101. I'll talk about how to establish a land bank if you indeed decide to have one. Talk a little bit about the governing law, and then we'll just kind of wrap up from there. So the first series of issues, these are a series of words that are specific to land banks and the issues that pertain to the problems we're trying to solve. We deal with blighted property, tax delinquent, distress, non-tax producing, foreclosed, and abandoned properties. And those words probably sound familiar to a lot of you in your communities, and so to basically emphasize that point, we put examples of properties that you may find in common in your communities. These are houses that have been either abandoned, they're foreclosed, they're vacant, apartment complexes that have sat stagnant for years, sometimes at time. You even have homes like this that have been consumed by kudzu and the forest, some that have been forgotten in time, like this one. Some that look not as obnoxious, but they're still kind of sitting there as eyesores to the community. Properties that have remained boarded, and you keep driving by and you're wondering, what do we do with those properties? And it's not just residential property, you also have commercial strips like this that have been abandoned, and you're wondering, what do we do with that? And additionally, this is an abandoned hotel that's also been stagnant in the community for a long period of time. So all those types of properties I just ran through really present issues for communities, because at the end of the day, we all want these types of desired property outcomes. We want to live in communities where their properties are code compliant. Everybody abides by common practices of keeping your property maintained. They're producing taxes. They're not a burden on the tax roll. They're actually providing tax benefit. They're occupied, as opposed to just oftentimes we board things up and contain them, but they're still unoccupied. So we like to have occupied structures. They're maintained. Share community space. That we have the opportunity to create community space, green space, things of that nature, and ultimately end up with this last point here. We all want to have vibrant and safe communities. That is the ultimate goal that we're all seeking for. So what is a land bank? They're very straightforward in terms of the mission of a land bank. Land banks are these public or nonprofit entities created by local governments to acquire, manage, maintain, and facilitate the redevelopment of this underutilized, vacant, blighted, tax delinquent property set that I just kind of reviewed. And this is a tool. So some folks think that land bank might be a cure-all. It is not, but it is a very important tool in converting these properties into a productive use. And productive use can really fall into that category of generating taxes, being occupied, and also fitting into what we think is a safe community. And these include residential, commercial, industrial, and green space purposes. So it's not just residential purposes. And the core competency of a land bank is really this acquisition and disposition of troubled, surplus, and vacant property. That's kind of the core goal of what a land bank does. I do like to emphasize this next point. Land banks do not have eminent domain or taxing authority. Those powers remain with the respective cities and counties. So people often get confused or they assume that land banks can do that, but we do not exercise that power. And oftentimes, land banks really step in where the market is not doing what we hope it would do or cannot do, because sometimes there are administrative and legal barriers and burdens that land banks can kind of nimbly navigate. So land banks have been around for a long time. 1971 was your first land bank established in St. Louis. It took several years to kind of gear up and get to Cleveland, Louisville, then Atlanta. So you see that's 20 years later after the first land bank, we established a land bank in Atlanta, which was the fourth in the United States. And so we're one of the old guys around the world of land banks. But you see from the list that we picked up a lot recently. 2011, New York, Philadelphia joined 2014. So you have almost 150 land banks throughout the United States, over half of which have been created since around 2009, 2010, after the real estate crisis. Folks have really been looking around the country for these tools that can help them deal with this real estate that they found to be surplus in their communities. So we have a lot in Georgia. Georgia has the third most number of land banks in the United States. And so this is just kind of a sampling. I like to show this slide because it shows you the diversity of the communities, ranging from a very large area like Fulton, Atlanta, to smaller areas like Thomasville and Thomas County. There are approximately 18 land banks. All of them are not on this slide, but we're adding them as we speak every day, and folks are finding them to be quite useful. So they focus on, again, I've mentioned the types of properties that they really focus on: residential, commercial, industrial, green space. They also can deal with surplus public property that cities, counties find themselves in possession of, foreclosed properties, abandoned properties, tax delinquent properties, and really properties is underutilized. So having seen all these types of reasons for why you might want one, how do you go about determining if you need a land bank? So this first one really just points out that this should be part of a broader strategy for your respective community. A land bank by itself is not going to cure your problem, but a land bank working in conjunction with code enforcement, with your planning department, with your development authority, with your nonprofit developers, for-profit developers, your real estate agents, all these other folks, you can end up with some great results. So kind of go through these simple series of questions. Why? Define your problem. Is your problem that you have too many abandoned foreclosed properties? Is your problem that you need green space? Is your problem that you have a lot of tax delinquency and tax foreclosure is not getting the problem solved? And once you define that problem, then you get down to the what. So what basically can be seen as success. How do you design the outcome? So problem definition, move to your desired outcome, because this actually directly impacts the scale of the organization. If you're going to deal with 5 properties a year, that entails a different scale than if you're going to deal with 300 properties per year. And so that is very important to think about as you start on this process of creating a land bank. Then also, once you figure that part out, then how? How are you going to operate it? Where's the money coming from? Who is going to staff it? And then lastly, who is going to run the land bank? So leadership is critical for the success of the land bank. Leadership is typically critical for most organizations. So triggers, as you kind of do your assessment of your community. Do you have a large inventory of abandoned and vacant property with kind of little or declining market value? That typically is one good reason to consider land bank. It's your tax foreclosure process not yielding results. So you ended up with property that no one is bidding on, and therefore it's not being cleared through the tax foreclosure process. You have these chronic code violations that kind of repeat and repeat and repeat. You have title problems with property that's been sitting there and no one can figure out who owns it. Then also governments have very restrictive property disposition requirements, and land banks by design can establish their own property disposition requirements. So that's another reason why you think about that. So as you work to establish it, land banks are independent tax-exempt authorities, so they pay no property taxes on anything they own. They're managed by independent boards, so they're not managed by the city, they're not managed by the county, they're managed by a board that has fiduciary responsibility to run the organization. The board is appointed by the city and the county. We'll talk about that further. And I've mentioned before, they have broad acquisition disposition authority in terms of how they conduct their business. So who can create a land bank? So the citizens just can't create a land bank. Local folks just can't create a land bank. You need at least 2 parties to start thinking about creating a land bank. At least one county and one city in that county have to basically decide they want a land bank. You can also have multiple counties and at least one city in each county to come together and form a land bank. Consolidated governments can decide to do a land bank, and then multiple consolidated governments can start a regional land bank authority. And how do you go about that process? First step, once you've figured out that you want one, you pass ordinances in respective governments that you want to do this. You create an intergovernmental agreement, but if you're a consolidated government, you don't need to do an intergovernmental agreement, because the intergovernmental agreement is basically the agreement that spells out how those 2 entities will work with the land bank and to provide governance, what are the responsibilities, what are the roles, and things of that nature. So clearly in a consolidated government, we only have one governing body. There's no need for that coordinated document. Appointment of board members. The board members are appointed by the city and the county, typically the mayor's office or the city council on the city side, or the county chair and the respective commissioners of the county will also appoint board members. And it's up to the cities and the counties to determine that split of board members. And we'll talk about the number that you actually have to negotiate around. And then, of course, creating bylaws and policies and procedures to run that. So going back to the intergovernmental agreement. So once you've laid out these resolutions by the city and county how to operate, This document basically is the governing document that lays out the responsibilities of the board. It actually gives you the powers of the land bank. The land bank statute is fairly broad, but you may not want to have all those powers resident to your land bank. So you can narrow it down, and that would be part of this intergovernmental agreement. And it also provides the dissolution process. But if after all this work, after several years, you put the land bank down and you decide you don't want it, well, this spells out how you would actually dissolve the entity and wind it down. So who runs it? The governance of the board, you have a 5 to 11 member board. That's a minimum 5, maximum 11 members of board members. Public officials are eligible to serve, so that means elected officials can serve on the board. Members serve without compensation. So this is another great opportunity for service without compensation for our local citizens. The majority of the board is needed for quorum to conduct business, just as you would have with any corporate entity that really governs itself by Robert's rules. And then also when you dispose of property, the majority of the board, the entire board, is required to be present when you have these large dispositions of property. So who can sit on this board? Some of you may be thinking, well, who would I actually appoint to a board? So elected officials, tax commissioners, code enforcement officers, zoning officials, private citizens, all those people are eligible to serve on the board. And all these people have served on some of the boards that exist throughout the state of Georgia. Backgrounds, you need to have folks that are knowledgeable about finance, law, real estate, banking, community activities, community development, and economic development are very helpful as they do the business of a land bank. These aren't necessary requirements. They are suggestions that the individuals have some element of this in their background. So you've created your land bank, you've set up your board, and now you figure out, well, how do I pay for this? So the city can come out of their general fund to make contributions. The county can come out of its general fund to make contributions. Both can do a bond issue to basically use those proceeds to support a land bank. Federal funds have been available to support land banks because community development block grant dollars, they're commonly known as CDBG funds. Staffing, how do you pay for the people that are going to run that? Don't really get caught up on that, because one thing that you can do is get very creative. You can use existing staff members in the city and the county and basically assign them to the land bank authority part-time to do the business of the land bank. There have been instances where city managers were also the executive directors of the land bank, because they only use land bank 2 or 3 times a month, so they need to staff up. But if you're very active, such as in my particular instance, I run the Fulton Atlanta Land Bank Authority, we have a full-time staff, and so we're there all the time, but we have a larger volume of activity. Legal support. This is real estate, so you have to have good legal support. You need lawyers, deal with title, you need to deal with all matters of real estate. So make sure you have funding available for that, unless you can find pro bono, but if you do that, it's a great bonus, but be prepared to pay. Maintenance of the properties. Land banks are not excluded from maintaining property. So just as we would expect citizens to maintain the property, so we expect a land bank. So be prepared to maintain the property, cut the grass, board the windows, pick up dumping, all those types of things. And you may decide that your public works department will do that for you, and that would be something you can basically weave into your city county budget. Otherwise, be prepared to pay a private vendor to provide payments. And insurance is important. This is a tax-exempt, nonprofit, quasi-governmental entity. It's not part of the city, it's not part of the county, so you're not self-insured, so you need to have private insurance for your assets. So key considerations as you do that. So it's a lot of information out here in terms of setting up land banks, how you create the governance, how you populate the board. So we put together a nice little manual, a how-to on land banks. And this is the website where you can find it. It's a free download that's available for everyone, and we created that back in June 2013. And it also includes templates. So if you wonder, what does an intergovernmental agreement look like? What does the resolution look like? What do the administrative policies look like? And how do you extinguish taxes? Samples are all included in this guide. So please download that, read through it, and Galda is always happy to answer your questions. So how did this all come about? The statute governing land banks in Georgia was initially passed in 1990. The land banks, you saw the list, have been growing throughout the country, and they've been evolving. So we kind of looked around and said, we're kind of in a tech world, so everybody else was on 3.0, and we were still on 1.0, or our beta. So we decided we needed to go to the state legislature and update our law. So in 2011, all the land banks in Georgia decided to create the Georgia Association of Land Bank Authorities, called GALBA. I serve as president. And this is really to serve as this entity that really provides education, technical assistance to government, citizens, stakeholders throughout the state of Georgia, and really just puts out information about land banks and how they should be operated. And so just as I'm doing this webinar today, these are types of services and things we do throughout the year to help our partners throughout the state of Georgia. So this bill was introduced in 2012. The sponsors were Senator Golden out of Valdosta and Representative Powell of Hartwell, Georgia. Passed almost unanimously and became law in July 1st of 2012. So what did it actually change? So the first law we found to be fairly narrow or fairly silent on a lot of things. So it made clear that land banks can acquire property through tax sales, donations, market purchases. So a variety of different ways you can bring property into a land bank. It also made it clear that land banks can contract with other parties, they can invest money, and they can borrow money. That was not clear in the first series of legislation. Again, they can manage, maintain, and hold property. Made clear they can extinguish delinquent property taxes. This is a unique power to the land banks. No other entity in the state of Georgia can extinguish delinquent taxes. And so, one thing to point out about this is that we can extinguish taxes regardless of the amount and regardless of the number of years in question, but it does require school board consent and review. The school board, the state law basically specifies that if a land bank's board, which is the body that would make this decision, decides to say we're going to clear taxes on delinquent taxes on a property so it can be, in essence, rebooted, you'll have to go to the school board and notify them, because typically school boards represent a large portion of tax bills. So before we go and start extinguishing taxes and impacting school budgets, we need to talk to the school board. By law, they have 30 days to review any notice or decision to extinguish taxes, and they can raise their hand and say we don't agree, or if they do not decide to reply, it's basically deemed consent, and you can proceed to pass the order on to the tax commissioner who then extinguish taxes. So it's a very important tool for areas, in particular we have areas where taxes have continued to accrue and property value declines. So this makes it a very helpful tool. Also made it clear we can dispose of property as we deem fit by land banks. So you can prioritize, for instance, you may say we want to do affordable housing, or we want to do, and therefore we're going to give preference to local nonprofits. You can give preference to folks that live in the state of Georgia versus folks that live outside of the state of Georgia. You can say if you are a slumlord effectively, or you have multiple code violations, we will not do business with you until you clear that. Land banks have that right and that authority to do that. So it's very important, and that allows you to basically reflect the desires of your local community, and that can be basically customized to fit your particular area. It spells out in the law, again, we do not have eminent domain and taxing power. It also points out for tax foreclosure sales. Previously, the land banks were able to tender what you would call a non-cash or credit bid. So the tax foreclosure sale, land bank could step up and say, we want that piece of property, but you have the unique ability to say, we're not going to pay the taxes, but we will cover the cost of the auction. So we'll pay the sheriff, tax commissioner, their cost. And basically, you could bring that property into the possession of the land bank. Now, if under the old law, if somebody bid $1 above that, then the land bank will lose. So now in the new law, if land banks are interested in a particular piece of property for a particular reason, they can then bid up. So if other parties come and bid for that property, land banks can then say, well, I want it also, and they can basically increase their bid. Big distinction. At this point, land banks basically become equivalent to a private bidder, and you have to pay cash. You lose the ability to extinguish taxes. So in that particular instance, the compelling reason is you really need this property. It might be a strategic assemblage for the community. There might be a reason why you want that piece of property in the possession of land banks. So that is something that the new law has and basically made clear. There's a tax recapture provision. So we talked previously about funding. So tax recapture is important. There is a 5-year, 75% tax recapture provision. What does that mean? So that means that any property that a land bank brings back on the tax rolls, for the first 5 years is back on the tax rolls or in an improved state, you can collect up to 75% of the non-school taxes. Basically can go into the land bank for operations. So what we're trying to do is align the activity of a land bank by bringing more non-productive property back to productive use, with this ability to generate basically supporting operating revenue. And the philosophy is that you're not taking away any money from anyone because these properties really weren't creating revenue in the first place. So we think this is a fair trade-off. This is common throughout the United States. And typically they're 5 years and 50%. We actually have 5 years and 75%. So we're actually one of the more generous in the country. And this basically allows you to supplement general fund funding or any other source you have that basically provides support to the land bank authority. So that's very important to point out. And so at the end of the day, so you established your land bank, you've created it, you have your board, you figured out your priorities, you understand the mechanics of it, you have your staff, or you have the resources, you have the property management, you have your lawyers, you have your funding mechanisms, you determine strategically which part of the city and county you want to go into. So ultimately, what are we trying to get to? Remember that first list, the nirvana set of conditions where everybody's maintaining the property and everything's safe and vibrant. So strategic outcomes that are typically supported, we help to eliminate blight or accelerate the elimination of blight. Typically, markets historically would absorb property, but we have some situations where the property inventory is so large, you just need this strategic tool to help. You can also, if you need to focus on affordable and market housing, this is a great tool to allow the public to become involved in the disposition of this property and also vetting the players that will potentially inherit the property or receive the property from a land bank authority. And just as I leave that particular point, if a city or county does a typical auction, they're not asking the background of the party that's acquiring the property. They're really saying, can you meet the maximum bid, can you meet the bid requirements and do that? In this case, a land bank can say, I need to know who you are. I need to know, do you have the experience? Do you have the capital to do this? And can you do this in a timely fashion? So this is something that a land bank can do. Then neighborhood revitalization. Having an entity that can focus and sit down in particular areas and basically really say, we're going to help you revitalize this area. We're a patient partner, and we can do this for a long period of time. It's very helpful too. And ultimately, a lot of folks figure out that controlling some of the land, not necessarily all of it, but having some of the land, maybe as anchor property that you can influence, is imperative to how you basically move forward with your revitalization projects and how you bring this property back to productive use. So more or less, that is kind of a broad overview of land banks, how they operate within the state of Georgia, a little bit of the history, and where we're going. And you have my contact information here, so please feel free to email me or give me a call, and I'm happy to either answer questions myself or refer you to the appropriate parties that can answer your questions. Thanks for listening and joining us today, and we look forward to helping you in the future.